Today I'm going to show you how to assemble frangipane sheets for the classic Petit glacé. Here I have two half sheets of my pre-baked frangipane, which is made with almond paste. And I also have my marzipan already made and wrapped and set aside so it doesn't dry out until I'm ready to use it. The first thing I need to do is to unmold my frangipane sheets. They're very cold right now. I just took them out of the refrigerator. So I'm going to heat the back of my sheet pan with a torch to soften the shortening that we used to grease the half sheet pan to get this sheet out. It's just easier to get it out of the pan when the bottom or the back of the sheet pan has been heated up with a torch. You want to make sure it's nice and warm, evenly heated and warmed. And because the top of the frangipane is very sticky right now, I'm going to put a piece of parchment paper over it. And I'm going to take another half sheet pan that's very flat, and I'm going to place it on top of the parchment paper. I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to pry out this sheet of frangipane with the parchment paper that we lined the pan with. I'm going to peel this parchment off and discard it. Then I'm going to get a clean piece of parchment paper and another half sheet pan. I'm trying to find the flattest sheet pans that I can. So I want the back of this frangipane to be the bottom of my Petit assemblage. I'm going to peel this parchment off. Actually, the sheet pan that I have it on is not flat, so I'm just going to slide this over onto a flatter half sheet pan. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a very small amount of apricot jam. This is baking jam. It's specifically formulated for pastry chefs. And I'm going to put a very, very thin layer of jam on my frangipane sheet and sandwich the next layer on top of it. If you put too much jam when you dip your Petit fours, the cakes might slip apart. So I would suggest that you not use a lot of jam. It's just going to cause problems for you if you overdo it. So just enough to make it tacky when you touch it, so that the two layers of cake that are sandwiched together don't slip apart. I'm going to take my next layer of frangipane, and once again I'm going to warm up the back with my torch. If you have a gas stove, you could always put your pan over the gas stove to warm up the back of it. And this is taking a while because this pan is really, really cold right now. And you want to handle your frangipane sheets cold. If you don't handle them cold, they're going to fall apart on you. They're very delicate, they're very soft. It's an extremely moist cake. And I'm going to take this pan and I'm going to put it directly over the jam. Try to line it up. And again, I'll just try to pry it out. It came out easily. The paper stayed inside the pan this time. And now I have my two frangipane sheets that are sandwiched together. I'm going to put another very thin layer of jam on top of this sandwiched layer of frangipan. Again, super thin, just enough to make the top tacky. And because this jam is made for pastry chefs and it's imported, it has a lot of flavor. So you don't really have to add a lot of jam to get that nice apricot flavor along with the almonds and the almond paste in the marzipan and the frangipan sheet. So I'm going to scrape off the excess again because I don't want my marzipan layer to slip. So I'm going to put this aside for now, and in the meantime I'm going to take my marzipan and I'm going to roll it out large enough to cover the frangipan sheet. So you want to maintain a rectangle along with you want to roll this marzipan out super thin. Like, you don't want a lot of marzipan on top of your petit fours, only because you don't need it. It's expensive and it has a ton of flavor in it. It's pretty much all almonds and sugar, so you don't need a lot of marzipan in order to get that delicious almond flavor in your petit fours. So this, I'm sprinkling powdered sugar or confectioner's sugar on the table so my marzipan doesn't stick to the table as I'm rolling it out. Now, I think I might need a little bit more. Let's start off with somewhat of a smooth rectangular shape. Sprinkle just a little bit more powdered sugar on top, and then I'm going to start to roll. Now you want to make sure that you maintain a rectangular shape with your marzipan. And I'm also making sure that it's not sticking to the table as I roll, because it will stick. Marzipan is pretty sticky, so always make sure that you can move it around and it's not sticking to the table. And I'm going to roll this out really thin, maybe a 32nd of an inch. It's not a 1/4 of an inch, that's for sure. And it's not a 16th. So I just want to make sure it's long enough and wide enough. Yep. A little bit wider. Okay. Now, get my French rolling pin. And I'm going to roll up this excess sugar off. I'm going to start to roll up my marzipan, just brushing off the excess sugar. It's not necessary, it doesn't need to be there. And I'll start on one end. Going to cover the sheet with my marzipan. Now what you want to do is you want to just cut off a little bit of the excess that's hanging over the edge. And then when I'm done with this, I'm just going to weight down these sheets. I'm going to put a piece of clean parchment on top. again, another half sheet pan on top of it, and then I'm going to put some weight on this. So we'll put some even weight on here. I need something a little heavier. So right now we have about 9 pounds, 10 pounds of weight on my petit fours, just to create a very even layer of petit fours when we're finished. So I'll let this sit for about 15 or 20 minutes and wrap them loosely, and I'm going to put them in the freezer, and I will cut them partially frozen. It's a lot easier to cut the petit fours partially frozen. You'll get a much cleaner cut, and again, the cakes won't slip and slide as you're attempting to cut the petit fours. Okay, so now we're going to cut our petit fours. I took these out of the freezer after about 3 hours, and I started a pre-cut on these so I wouldn't spend too much time cutting them. So I started first cutting a straight edge on each side of the petit four to create a right angle. You need to start with the right angle, and I like to cut my petit fours an inch square. So from the pre-cut edge of the petit four, I measure an inch all the way across on both ends, and then I cut. So one strip of petit fours has already been cut in this direction, and now I'm going to cut my 1 inch on the other end, and you can see that I've already marked my petit fours. Now that I'm cutting the long edge of the petit fours, I'm only going to start from the middle of the sheet and cut down. Every time I cut, I should clean my knife. I'm using a sharp chef's knife. Each cut requires me to clean my knife with a damp towel. That way, the stickiness from the petit fours doesn't cling to the knife and therefore create an unclean cut every time you slice. So I'm going to cut through this entire sheet. I'm going to go as quickly as I can. I'm following my 1 inch grid marks. Don't worry if they pop out like this, you can push them back in. And this is the very end of the sheet here. So I have a little extra pieces left over. I'm going to flip this around, and then I'm going to cut in the other direction. And the reason why I do this is because obviously this knife is not long enough to cut through the entire sheet. And I'm just rocking the knife straight down instead of dragging it through the petit fours, like starting here and then pulling the blade towards me would just cause all these petit fours to shift and move and lose their beautiful square or cube shape that we've worked so hard to create here. And once I finish cutting all these petit fours, I'm going to wrap them in plastic wrap extremely well. And I like to dip my petit fours frozen so they hold their shape and they look nice and square. So as you can see, this is a cross section of the inside of the petit four, and you can see our marzipan here, our 2 sheets of frangipane and the apricot in between. So we pre-cut the petit fours, and then we put them in the freezer to get super firm. Make sure they're wrapped extremely well in the freezer so they don't sweat. And what we're gonna do is we're going to dip the petit fours frozen so they maintain their shape and they don't like slip and slide. The layers don't slip from each other, okay? What I do is I dip my petit fours in a coating chocolate. You can dip your petit fours in the traditional fondant icing. It's much more difficult to manage and keep at a specific temperature and consistency to dip your petit fours properly. I also find that fondant is very sweet and the petit four is naturally sweet, so I didn't want to add additional sweetness in the icing, so I chose to use coating chocolate, which gives it a nice thin shell, a nice crunch, and it doesn't add a tremendous amount of sweetness to your petit four. When you dip your petit four, you want to make sure that you drop the petit four into the chocolate face down. So the top of the petit four is the marzipan layer. You're going to dip it in face down and you're going to scoop it up using a fork. And I'm going to tap the excess chocolate off the petit four and scrape the bottom so that I don't get any feet. And you can see how thin the shell of chocolate is on the petit four. And I just kind of push the petit four off the surface of my fork gently so I don't leave a mark. Make sure you tap all the excess chocolate off the petit four so you don't get any unnecessary feet. And those feet is basically what the chocolate that drips off the side of the petit four, and then you get kind of like a lot of excess chocolate on your petit four. Try to dip as quickly as possible. If you can't dip them as quickly as I do, leave your extra petit fours in the freezer until you're ready to dip. When you're using coating chocolate, it's important to keep it tempered and warm. So you'll notice that I occasionally stir the chocolate to keep it tempered. So after a couple of dips, I'll stir my chocolate. If you notice, I have it on a double boiler here. Some steaming water underneath. It's actually a cake pan that I use so that this will fit inside the double boiler and keep the chocolate warm. Every so often when you stir your chocolate, you're allowing to maintain a nice warm temperature, and that will allow you to dip the petit four and achieve a very thin chocolate shell. Okay, so I dipped how many here? 3, 6, 8. And this last one is starting to get very soft. I can feel it sliding apart. So make sure that you only dip as many as you can manage before they get too soft. And then the next step is trimming and decorating. So after you've dipped your petit fours, your chocolate should harden fairly quickly. And then if you notice, there's some residual chocolate here, what we call feet, and we're just going to trim with a sharp paring knife the excess chocolate. They're pretty sturdy. They hold up well after they're dipped. They won't slip and slide, and then you would cup them in little tiny paper cups if you'd like. And then I'm going to decorate them next. So I'm going to decorate these in a very classic petit four design using additional coating chocolate and a cornet bag, which I'd like to do another video on, just how to make a cornet bag and pipe in chocolate. Because using a cornet bag is one of the fundamental skills required in pastry making, from cookies and petit fours to pastries and cakes. So it's one of the tools that you're going to need to master in order to execute finer designs in pastry arts. With a little bit of green. The nice thing about chocolate is you can customize the colors Create any design that you'd like. A lot easier to work with than royal icing in my eyes. Tastes much better. Although royal icing is the classic final touch on Petit Fours. We're just adding a modern approach to it. Okay, so you could store your Petit Fours at room temperature as long as they're held in a very cool environment. Otherwise, long term, you can store them refrigerated in an airtight container, but bring them to room temperature before you serve them. I'm just gonna cut one of these Petit Fours so you can see internally what it looks like. So this is your very thin shell of white chocolate on the outside, your 2 layers of frangipane, apricot, there's another layer of apricot preserves, and delicious marzipan icing.